Many industrial disasters are sudden. However, others have a slower, more subtle buildup. A series of small mistakes or a chain of poor decisions can stack up over time until, much like a runaway train, circumstances pass the point of no return. The story of the ODECO Ocean Express is one such example. When she capsized in 167 feet of water, approximately 28 miles off the coast of Port O'Connor, Texas, in 1976, 13 men died as a result. Some of the members of our audience knew these men. Although one would like to think that ODECO and the industry fully learned from the multiple lessons that came out of this tragedy, that would sadly prove not to be the case. The events and circumstances surrounding the capsizing of the Ocean Express foreshadowed the eventual doom of another, more famous member of the ODECO fleet, the Ocean Ranger, just 6 years later in 1982. In this two-part documentary series, we'll take an in-depth technical look at both individual stories. We'll also explore the undeniable and tragic connections between them. Without further ado, please enjoy our first case study in the series. This is Final Stop, the Ocean Express story, right here on Oilfield History. To fully appreciate the story of the Ocean Express, we must trace things all the way back to small-town Arkansas around the turn of the 20th century. Charles Murphy Sr. was the owner of several country banks near El Dorado City at the time. In 1907, Murphy sold most of the banks and used the proceeds to purchase several tracts of timber farming land nearby. Although the timber business was profitable, Charles suspected there were also oil reserves buried deep under his fields, and he was willing to risk a substantial amount of capital to prove it. As luck would have it, Murphy was right, and in 1921, oil was struck at the Smackover Field in Union County, Arkansas, smack dab in the middle of Murphy's holdings. The discovery at Smackover marked the beginning of Murphy's transition from timber to oil and also set the tone for his forward-thinking, risk-tolerant way of doing business. Despite Murphy Sr.'s failing health, the company continued to grow year after year with discoveries of new onshore fields in the Arkansas and Louisiana area. Eventually, Murphy Sr. was succeeded by his son, Charles Murphy Jr., shortly after the young man returned from serving in World War II. After taking over the reins from his father and officially incorporating in Louisiana in 1950, Charles Murphy Jr. continued to expand operations across the United States, acquiring fields in places as far away as Montana. However, another frontier that had yet to be thoroughly explored existed right in Murphy's backyard, and that was the coastal waters of the Gulf of Mexico. By the time Alden Laborde approached him in 1953 with the idea of taking a traditional barge and converting it into a floating drilling rig, Murphy was ready to back him with $500,000 after several other industry players had already passed on the opportunity. The plan was greenlit, and the Ocean Drilling and Exploration Company, or ODECO for short, was born. The following year, the partnership's first mobile offshore drilling rig, the Mr. Charlie, named after Murphy's father, was completed and began work for Shell Oil Corporation in the Gulf. Murphy and ODECO's calculated gamble paid off in spades. ODECO would go on to grow rapidly with the rise of the insatiable post-World War II demand for fossil fuels. At peak, the company would boast a fleet of several dozen semi-submersible and jack-up drilling rigs, one of which is the focus of today's story. The Ocean Express was a jack-up floating drilling rig that was added to the ODECO fleet in 1975. Jack-ups are floating barges that support a drilling derrick. Most recognizably, they also have 3 to 4 long steel legs that can be used to jack up the vessel hull to the desired height where it can be used as a stable working platform. Being able to plant legs into the ground is an advantage during storms because it makes the vessel more stable as she's resisting high wind and wave forces. For those of you who watched our previous episode on the Seacord Power lift boat, you'll notice a lot of similarities. The main difference is that the lift boat is self-propelled while jackups must rely on other vessels such as tugboats to move them. Built by Bethlehem Steel Corporation, the Ocean Express measured 166 feet long by 109 feet wide. In addition to her drilling derrick, she also boasted a helideck, a 56-man accommodation, and the ability to operate in up to 250 feet of water. This large operational window was enabled by her mat foundation. Unlike more traditional jacking legs that have feet or piles affixed directly to the ends of them, a mat foundation is essentially just that, a large, flat steel mat that ties the jackup's legs together. When the mat is lowered to the seafloor, instead of supporting the vessel at several individual points, the load is more evenly distributed. In the case of the Ocean Express, her mat was A-shaped and sized slightly larger than the footprint of the main vessel hull for additional stability. Her mat was also bordered by a 2-foot skirt, which is a steel, reinforced shoulder that's perpendicular to the main mat body. Skirts are designed to dig into the seafloor and provide additional resistance against sliding. Mooring points are critical for any rig that's reliant on tug assistance. The Express had multiple inset towing pad eyes on either side of the forward position of the main deck. At the aft end of the main deck, there were also mooring bits on either corner. Notably, however, there were no mooring points being used on the upper deck, further away from the waterline. This shouldn't have been an issue under normal circumstances, since the main deck should never have been underwater. However, if that ever were to happen, critical mooring points on the main deck might no longer be accessible by the crew. April 13th, 1976, 0900 hours. 2 days before the incident. An ODECO barge mover boards the Ocean Express with instructions to move her from Gulf of Mexico Block 803 to Block A57. The rig is operating near the Texas Gulf Coast just south of Port O'Connor. The estimated voyage distance is 33 miles and, if all goes well, it should only take about 12 hours. Already waiting on board are the ODECO drilling crew and 7 representatives from client Marathon Oil. Marathon has hired ODECO and the Ocean Express to perform their drilling work in Block A57. 2 companies have worked together for many years on similar jobs, and this is a normal operation for everyone involved. Let's take a quick look at the chain of command for ODECO offshore operations. During normal activities when the rig is jacked up and drilling on location, a drilling specialist called the tool pusher is in charge. This man's authority is complete, extending over all personnel on board, whether they're drillers or housekeeping staff. When the vessel's on hire, the tool pusher is also joined by a client-side counterpart. This man is most often referred to as the drilling superintendent, or, more lovingly, the company man. The company man is on board to represent the client's interests, interface with the tool pusher, and manage any other company support staff that are on board. He's essentially responsible for the well that's being drilled, while the tool pusher is responsible for the rig, her crew, and safe marine operations. Now comes the barge mover. Barge movers play a unique role. These specialists are in charge of all operations that involve moving rigs from one location to another. According to ODECO company policy, their authority is also complete, albeit temporary. Whenever the barge mover is on board a moving vessel, he is the ultimate authority over the crew in all decision-making. This scope can include towing, jacking up, jacking down, holding position over a drill site, and ballasting operations. This command structure that ODECO is using is not uncommon in industry. It works well when jobs run smooth. Human relationships are messy, though, and like any organization, this can expose flaws when pressure is applied. For example, the men on board working for ODECO are used to being under the direct supervision of the tool pusher day in and day out. Although there's a dotted line temporarily drawn between them and the barge mover during transit, unless the tool pusher and the company man explicitly endorses leadership in front of the crew, his control over the vessel and ability to direct safe operations may be compromised. Even then, in the event of an emergency, human psychology dictates that the men are most likely to revert to following their normal leadership on board. April 14th, 1976, 0700 hours. General vessel preparations are complete. The barge mover checks the National Weather Service forecast. Current conditions at the original drilling location are calm. Over the course of the voyage, seas are expected to rise to 4 to 6 feet, with accompanying winds out of the southeast until they diminish in the early hours of April 15th. This forecast is slightly elevated, but is well within the operational limits of the Express and is therefore deemed acceptable. The barge mover would later testify that he did not have access to any additional site-specific weather forecast information at the time at his disposal. This directly contradicts testimony from Marathon Oil staff, who claim that they supplied him with the location-specific reports that they receive on a daily basis from a third-party weather service. Under the impression that the weather will allow for safe transit, the barge mover now orders the hull lowered into the water and the legs retracted. By 10 o'clock, the operation is complete. The hull is floating in the water, and the foundation mat has been raised off bottom to a draft of 80 feet. Block 803, where the vessel is currently located, only has a water depth of 124 feet, while the destination block, A57, has an expected water depth of 199 feet. To save time, the barge mover has elected to not raise the mat the entire distance back up to the bottom of the main hull. deeming his clearance sufficient to avoid any obstructions during transit. The barge move is also being supported by 3 local tugs, Gulf Explorer, Gulf Viking, and Gulf Knight. Supplied by Gulf Mississippi Marine Corporation, these 3 boats are specifically designed to help pull and push large vessels around the ocean. Leading the group is the sturdy Gulf Explorer. Built in Slidell, Louisiana in 1967, the Explorer measures 117 feet in length with a breadth of 32 feet. She boasts 2 twin 8-cylinder Fairbanks Morse diesel engines that can supply a total of 3,600 horsepower for towing. The Gulf Knight and the Gulf Viking are slightly smaller, but still substantial, offering 2,400 horsepower apiece. As part of the planning phase of the voyage, these tugs would have been sized and selected by ODECO engineers based on their ability to provide enough combined towing capacity to overcome anticipated drag forces as the Ocean Express is being towed through the open ocean, potentially during storm weather conditions. The barge mover orders his 3 assisting tugs into his desired towing configuration. The Explorer is at the starboard bow, while the smaller Knight and Viking share the portside bow. At 11 o'clock, transit begins with a heading of 62 degrees. April 14th, 1976, 23:30 hours. The Ocean Express and her towing spread arrive safely on location. Conditions at the moment are as expected, with 4 to 6 foot seas and 10-knot winds. Jacking operations commence to get the mat on bottom and give the vessel maximum stability. April 15th, 1976, 0100 hours. Sea states have worsened in the wee hours of the morning. Waves are now approximately 10 feet with winds of nearly 35 knots. It's at this point that the barge mover deems he's outside the operational limits for leg lowering and decides to stop the operation before completion for fear of damaging the jacking system. The mat pauses at a 148-foot draft, just 51 feet shy of the bottom. Meanwhile, the tugs are ordered to rearrange themselves from towing configuration to a holding configuration to help the rig ride out the storm. Gulf Explorer is reattached to the starboard side stern, while Gulf Knight takes up the port stern. Despite not being the strongest tug in the spread, the Gulf Viking is attached to the portside bow and given the task of leading the effort to hold the Ocean Express's bow into the oncoming waves to reduce their impact. April 14th, 1976, early morning hours. The situation continues to deteriorate. The Ocean Express's crew has begun to notice water ingress to various storerooms, shops, and the accommodation. Some water has even snuck its way down past the sealed vent openings and is now dripping from the ceiling-like fixtures in the accommodation. All of this is serving to reduce the overall vessel freeboard by several inches and produce a slight list to starboard. Despite all this, 6 crewmen have arrived on location and been transferred over to the Express with much difficulty by supply vessel M.V. Levy. The men are from subcontractor Ocean Hammer and are technical specialists required for the upcoming drilling campaign. Although no one's aware of it at the time, several of these men have effectively signed their own death warrants by persisting with the transfer operation that morning. Checking back in on our tow arrangement, all tugs are still attached at this point. However, the Viking is beginning to struggle a bit in her lead position. At noon, her captain orders his crew to pay out more tow line to compensate for the rising seas. As the seas rise, it's clear that the environment on site is beginning to deviate substantially from the National Weather Service forecast. The company man, who has access to site-specific weather forecasts paid for by Marathon Oil, calls his home office to request the latest. These localized reports appear to be slightly more accurate, predicting upcoming wind gusts of 45 miles an hour, coupled with up to 18-foot seas. As mentioned previously, the company man would later testify that he passed this forecast to the barge mover, but the barge mover denied ever having received it. April 15th, 1976, 15:10. Although the Viking has successfully mitigated the additional load she's experiencing from the winds and waves up until now, a problem now develops on the Gulf Knight. The reduction gear in the Knight's starboard engine has failed. With only 2 engines on board, horsepower is immediately cut in half. The Knight's captain must now hastily phone the barge mover to inform him of the situation. Somewhat surprisingly, given that there are only 2 other tugs in the flotilla, the barge mover offers to release the Knight entirely from her line, allowing her to return safely to port for maintenance. This would leave the Express with just 2 tugs at approximately 70% of her original towing capacity remaining. Gulf Knight declines, though, and remains connected at half power, now taking up a trailing position off the Express's stern. She'll stay on location until a relief tug can arrive and take her place early the next day. April 15th, 1976, early evening. With the Gulf Knight's misfortune and the seas continuing to worsen, the crew of the Ocean Express has spent the afternoon scurrying around the vessel, closing watertight doors, securing hatch covers, shutting ventilation points, and stopping any small leaks they discover. They've also needed to pump out approximately 2 to 6 inches of water that's begun accumulating in the living quarters, galley, and storerooms. The situation is clearly dire, but morale is in a decent spot as everyone is banding together to combat the common enemy of the storm they find themselves caught in. As daylight gives way to night, though, the situation is looking increasingly grim. The Express is now pitching and rolling up to 8 degrees in the heavy seas, taking direct hits from waves across her main deck. Impressively, amidst the chaos raging around them, tugs Gulf Explorer and Gulf Viking are managing to hold the Express on station. April 15th, 1976, 19:30 hours. Eventually, though, luck runs out. A sharp crack is heard as the Gulf Viking's mooring line parts. 20 to 25 foot seas simply prove too much for her to handle. The Express is now left with just one full-strength tug, the Gulf Explorer, to protect her from the raging seas. Crews on all vessels now nervously watch as the Ocean Express slowly begins to rotate to her port side in an uncontrolled manner. The Explorer is giving it everything she's got, but without her 2 fellow tugs to support her, she's effectively holding on for dear life rather than controlling the Express. The Express is now drifting northwest towards shore, and the tug captains and the barge mover are excitedly discussing what to do about it over the radio. The first suggestion is that the Explorer be relocated to one of the 2 forward mooring bits where she'll have the best chance of dragging the Express back into proper alignment. Unfortunately, electing to not position her there in the first place when seas were calmer is proven to be a critical mistake. Given the heavy seas, the barge movers are reluctant to disconnect any tugs that are still attached for fear of leaving the Express completely adrift and at the full mercy of Mother Nature. Instead, attempts are made to reattach the Viking to the port bow mooring bit. While the Viking's crew recovers and repairs her parted line, a 3-man team on board the Express is dispatched to the port bow triangular deck where the mooring is located. Unfortunately, the team finds it impossible to heave the heavy, sea-soaked mooring line with its large shackle up out of the water so they can work on it. In the process, a large wave knocks them down, slamming open the weld shop door behind them and filling it with 4 feet of standing water. The combined effect of the loss of freeboard due to water ingress and massive waves have resulted in all the original main deck level mooring points being awash like this. They're all now effectively no longer accessible to the crew to work on, and they don't have any backup bits at higher deck elevations already connected. Despite several resourceful attempts to secure a new line to alternative strongpoints such as the crane pedestal, attempts to reconnect the Viking ultimately fail and are abandoned. The Ocean Express is also equipped with a 10,000-pound anchor affixed to the end of a 1,000 foot of cable that she can drop. When the barge mover brings up the idea, however, the tool pusher shoots it down for fear of damaging the mat footing when it's dropped. The barge mover dispatches an electrician anyways to check on the readiness of the system should they decide to use it. However, in all the commotion, the anchor appears to have been quickly forgotten about as neither the barge mover nor the electrician follow up with one another about it. April 15th, 1976, 19:45 hours. To make matters worse, a particularly large wave now strikes the back deck of the Express, finally jarring her heavy cargo of drill pipe, drill collars, and well casing loose. Several long steel tubes are now sliding precariously around the back deck, threatening to further jeopardize the integrity of the Express if they puncture any critical seals such as vent closures. At this point, both the tool pusher and the company man have seen enough. They trip the vessel general alarm, setting lights and sirens blaring on board. Crew members that were previously fast asleep now leap from their bunks in a mad dash to don life jackets and assemble to the muster area on the upper deck. The barge mover strongly disagrees with this move. Perhaps blinded by pride, he thinks the Express can still be saved. The ODECO main office now receives a phone call from the company man on board. He's apparently acting on his own accord outside the direction of the barge mover. He requests that the Coast Guard be sent to remove all Marathon Oil client reps from the vessel. ODECO Shore Support quickly phones the Coast Guard at 2010, and by 2018, a chopper is airborne, making a beeline from Corpus Christi to the Ocean Express's position. April 15th, 1976, 20:30 hours. ODECO's main office receives another phone call from the Express. This time, it's the barge mover. Apparently unaware of the call placed previously by the company man, he explains the situation again and requests advice on what to do. He recounts the blown tug engine, parted tow line, water on deck, loose drilling cargo, and estimated seas of 20 to 25 feet. After some brief discussion, both parties agree to expedite the sending of a larger tug to attempt to reconnect and save the Express. April 15th, 1976, 20:40 hours. Again, seemingly still unaware of the actions taken by the company man, when the incoming Coast Guard helicopter attempts to make radio contact with the Ocean Express bridge, the barge mover tells them that their assistance is not required. Overhearing the conversation from across the room, the Marathon man shouts at the barge mover that the chopper is not there to support the Express, but rather to evacuate the Marathon crew on board to safety. Heated discussion ensues, and eventually the barge mover relents, allowing the Coast Guard chopper to continue approaching towards their position in preparation for evacuating the Marathon employees. April 15th, 1976, 2100 hours. The situation continues to deteriorate as the drilling derrick breaks loose, sliding to starboard and adding 2 more degrees to the Express's list, making a total of 10. It was later discovered that nobody on board had remembered to check the status of the derrick's locking pins prior to storm onset. Now, in open defiance of any authority that the barge mover had left, the tool pusher and company man go full rogue and order all personnel to abandon ship immediately. Defaulting to the leadership that they're normally accustomed to in a panicked state, the entire crew complies with the directive. 14 men board life capsule number 1 and 20 men board life capsule number 3, both of which are located on the starboard upper deck. After one last unsuccessful attempt to convince the barge mover to join them in the evacuation, the life-saving vessels are both successfully launched, leaving one very lonely man still on board. April 15th, 1976, 21:15 hours. After such an extended time refusing to accept the reality of a situation and the now inevitable doom of the Ocean Express, the barge mover finally relents and requests that the Coast Guard chopper evacuate him. He climbs to the very top of the helideck and awaits rescue. Lieutenant Commander John M. Lewis, who's piloting the aircraft at the time, will later recount a scene during his testimony that more closely resembles an action movie than anything you'd imagine seeing offshore. On his first attempt to recover the barge mover, the vessel is listing at approximately 25 to 30 degrees towards starboard, taking heavy hits on her portside bow from incoming waves. After that fails, a second attempt is made with similar results. When he brings his aircraft around for a third try, Lewis observes the Express groaning at a clearly untenable 45-degree list. Miraculously, this time the barge mover is somehow able to climb into the lowered man basket and depart with the helicopter literally seconds before it's too late. At approximately 21:30 hours on April 15th, 1976, everyone on scene sees the Ocean Express give one last groan and pass the point of no return. She capsizes, then disappears beneath the ocean waves. By the time the Ocean Express goes under, all support tugs have either lost or severed their connections to her to avoid being pulled down. Now free of this restriction, they turn their attention to the lifeboats they saw launched before the rig capsized. The lifeboats used on the Ocean Express are a particularly interesting design. A quick glance tells us why the label capsule is more appropriate than boat for these vessels. Built by ODECO Corporation, the 1991 series life capsule has a distinctly circular shape rather than a typical ship shape. Occupants sit mainly around the outer edge of the capsule facing inward, while a smaller number sit in a ring in the middle facing outward. This unique arrangement enables the capsule to be suspended and dropped from a single connection point at its center. As part of their installation service, Whittaker Corporation provides training on proper use of the capsule. Their training even goes as far as to state that the capsules are, quote, unsinkable. Although the 1991 model has in fact passed all required Coast Guard certification tests to be approved for commercial use, including the standard capsizing test, it still certainly has limitations. Most notably, Whittaker has only tested the capsules against capsizing in 7-foot seas. They also recommend that the vessel not be towed, as the strong point for a tow connection is not reachable from the open hatch at the top of the capsule. A man would need to exit the capsule through the main side boarding door, presumably amidst heavy seas, to affix any tow line to the properly designed attachment point. Initially, the Gulf Explorer and Gulf Knight both proceed to life capsule number 2, finding her floating in an inverted position nearby. After several frantic minutes spent trying to right her, the crews eventually realize that there are no persons inside. In fact, waves swept life capsule number 2 off the port side of the Express before evacuation was even being attempted. While the Explorer and Knight deal with capsule number 2, life capsule number 1 is slowly motoring herself away from the wreckage. Survey vessel Nicole Martin approaches her and lassos her release hook on top. After securing the capsule to the Martin's side, all 14 men aboard, slowly but surely, transfer over to the Martin, although not without difficulty, as the 8 feet of relative motion between the two vessels and the occasional wave slamming the capsule into the Martin's side caused some of the men to mistime their jumps, nearly sending them plunging into the raging waters. Although the Martin crew then tries to recover the capsule, bringing her around to stern, the line slips loose as she goes adrift with the doors still open. She'll later be found floating inverted some miles away from the wreckage. While the Martin is recovering the men inside capsule number 1, Gulf Viking is attempting to do the same with capsule number 3. She overtakes them as they also motor away from the capsizing site. The men inside affix a line with the strobe light to their release hook and throw it in the Viking's direction. The Viking crew retrieves it and secures it to their aft bit before throwing a larger line of their own back towards the capsule to provide a more robust tether. The Viking then backs up to the capsule, stern to seas, as she attempts to bring them alongside, just like the Martin did for capsule number 1. Unfortunately, this stern approach leaves the capsule fully exposed to the raging seas, and they suddenly find themselves being tossed violently against the side of the Viking with each passing wave. In later interviews, survivors would state that the contact was so violent that they expected the capsule to shatter altogether. Acting quickly, the capsule occupants elect to cast the Viking's large line off entirely. This leaves them with only a single, small line connected to the Viking's stern. They shout to the Viking to tow them with this configuration, presumably wanting to reach calmer waters before re-attempting any personnel transfer. As the bright orange capsule drifts back towards the Viking's stern, however, misfortune strikes again. A 50-foot wave now strikes both vessels unexpectedly. The back deck of the Viking is awash with seawater. As the crew scrambles to recover, they simultaneously look off the back deck to see the life capsule they had been trying to rescue just moments earlier flip up on her aft end, pause momentarily, then overturn. Immediately, Viking is back on the rescue effort, retrieving the severed line floating nearby and attempting to reattach it to right the capsule. However, this line snaps. 2 even larger lines are cast from the Viking, lassoing the exposed capsule stabilizer. However, these lines snap as well. Finally, a 4th heavy-duty line is employed, and this time it breaks the stabilizer off completely. It's at this point that bodies begin appearing in the water. In total, 5 men are rescued by the Gulf Viking, and another 2 men are rescued by the Gulf Knight. However, 13 are still unaccounted for, presumably trapped inside the overturned capsule, bobbing and heaving in the heavy waves. More unsuccessful attempts to right the vessel are launched as precious minutes continue ticking by. At 22:45, the Viking requests Coast Guard diver support. They're holding out hope that the men that are still in the water have found an air pocket in the top of the overturned capsule to keep them alive just a little longer. The Viking's request for diver support is passed to a naval station in Corpus Christi, as well as the nearby aircraft carrier, USS Lexington. At 01:30 hours on April 16th, Lexington dispatches a chopper to the scene with a diver on board. After he arrives on site and is lowered into the water, though, the seas are deemed too rough for him to connect any lines to the capsule, and he's recovered to the aircraft, which hovers nearby until Lexington arrives on scene around 02:38. Meanwhile, 2 Navy Reserve divers are also on a Coast Guard helicopter en route to the accident site. Upon arrival, the first man is dropped into the water, but he's too far away. The stormy seas and dark night prevent him from locating the capsule. The second man has better luck, and he's able to swim to the overturned vessel. Once there, he notes the open capsule door and reports being able to see stationary human legs floating inside when peering through one of the windows. The time is now 0330, roughly 6 hours since the Ocean Express capsized and roughly 4 hours since life capsule number 3 overturned. A line from the Gulf Viking is passed to the Navy diver. However, it's still a struggle to find a strong connection point on the capsule hull. He manages to choke the line around a handrail, but the rail is ripped off when the righting attempt is made. The team makes several similar attempts in the following hours, only to yield the same frustrating result. At 0726 hours, the Coast Guard helicopter returns from Corpus Christi with 2 additional commercial divers. By 0843 hours, the men are in the water. This time, after first unsuccessfully attempting to secure a cargo net around the capsule hull, they're able to locate the eye bolts that are attached to the capsule flange. The divers hook up a shackle and cable assembly from Lexington to one of these strong points, and the capsule is then finally recovered to the carrier's deck. The bodies of the missing 13 men are all inside. They've drowned during the rescue attempt. The ODECO Ocean Express, now at the bottom of the Gulf of Mexico, was valued at $20 million and was deemed a total loss. The barge move had started out well enough, but as the analogy at the beginning of the video alluded to, by the early hours of April 15th, her situation was careening out of control. Now we'll examine the mistakes and fateful decisions that ultimately led to her demise. Lesson learned number 1, procedural gaps. In the wake of the Ocean Express disaster, one of the obvious mistakes uncovered by investigation were the many glaring gaps in emergency and pre-emergency procedures. Every Coast Guard certified seagoing vessel is required to have a Marine Operations Manual, also referred to by abbreviation as the vessel's MOM, on board. This document is custom written for each individual ship and should contain all necessary critical information such as drawings, operational limits, and explanations of how to respond to various emergencies. The Ocean Express's fabricator, Bethlehem Steel, had developed her MOM during the design phase as part of their normal shipbuilding process. However, just because a document is published and on board doesn't guarantee that it's complete. In fact, one can imagine how it would be difficult for Bethlehem Steel, who didn't actually operate many of the vessels they were building at the time, to ensure that they considered every possible scenario that could be encountered. To mitigate this, the MOM was also reviewed by ODECO and Coast Guard engineers. However, there were still several glaring omissions. For example, there were no essential checklists for securing cargo, locking down open holes to prevent water ingress, and making ready other critical vessel components such as the drilling derrick prior to transit or incoming weather. Water entry to places like the living quarters and storerooms reduced the Ocean Express's freeboard, gave her a starboard list, and ultimately made it easier for her to have boarding waves and capsize. Things got even worse when the drill pipe cargo broke loose on deck, and worse still when the unsecured drilling derrick shifted during the storm. Having a watertight vessel and fully secured cargo are critical parts of vessel stability, and thorough checklists should be a part of any MOM to ensure that's achieved. Number 2, lack of a full range of clear stability calculations for all potential leg positions. Post-capsizing analysis demonstrated that, with her mat at an extended draft of 148 feet, the Ocean Express unknowingly reduced her righting arm by 35%. This leg configuration wasn't covered in the MOM, and so the barge mover was likely unaware that he was severely compromising his vessel's stability by keeping her there. MOM should include thorough coverage of all configurations so there's less ambiguity for operators. Interestingly, the Ocean Express debacle eventually helped pass a new Coast Guard requirement that all vessels be analyzed for partially damaged as well as fully intact stability conditions during the design phase. Number 3. No mention of what can be expected, such as physical damage, sounds, loss of functionality, etc., if jacking operations are performed outside of operational limits. Part of what doomed the Express was that the jacking operations were halted when seas were still subjectively at or only slightly above the operational limits listed in the MOM. Had the barge mover been aware of the potential consequences of continuing to lower the legs all the way to the seafloor, he may not have been discouraged by light damage and groaning sounds that, although not ideal, could have given him a chance to plant his legs on bottom and avoid disaster. Subsea investigations of the seafloor near the capsizing site also suggested that the combined influence of loss of freeboard, extreme vessel list, and extended legs caused the edge of the mat to catch on bottom as she was drifting, effectively tripping her and initiating the final capsizing event. Number 4. Lack of explicit guidance on towing plans, tow arrangements, and minimum tugboat horsepower requirements. The Express's mom provided no guidance for how to use tugs to move the vessel, even though this was part of their regular operations. Having minimum tug specs, including task-specific mooring arrangements, likely would have prevented subtle but critical mistakes that the Ocean Express made. For example, a predetermined holding arrangement could have engineered out the mistake of leaving one of the smaller tugs, Gulf Viking, responsible for holding the Express into heavy oncoming seas. It may also have led to prefixing of lines to higher mooring bits on the upper deck so they could still be accessed in the event that the main deck became awash. Number 5. Lack of knowledge of how to respond to emergencies. One can see from the explanation of the Ocean Express's final hours how the leadership was in some capacity reacting to their circumstances instead of calmly responding to them. Details such as the argument over whether it was advisable to drop anchor or not suggest a general lack of awareness of how to operate and respond to significant yet predictable problems of heavy seas. Another industry change that the Ocean Express incident helped push that many in the audience may already be aware of are the now weekly emergency drills on board many floating facilities. Lesson learned number 2, life capsules. Another interesting part of the story post-capsizing are the struggles that rescuers had dealing with the Ocean Express's unorthodox life capsules. All 3 Ocean Express life capsules were fully certified. This means they had to pass Coast Guard review and field testing, a program which includes operating under partially flooded conditions, operating while heeling due to off-center passengers, launching, towing, and more. While under tow, the line pulling the capsule was designed to be connected to the eye bolts located in the vessel flange. As you may recall, this was ultimately the strong point used by USS Lexington to recover the flip capsule. However, these eye bolts were not accessible from the cab while the capsule was upright, and furthermore, Whitaker themselves recommended that the vessel not be towed if there was an option not to, stating that it was safer to drift under rough sea conditions until waters calmed and transfer to a new vessel could occur. During the rescue attempt, crew members inside life capsule number 3 made several critical errors, including attempting to have the Gulf Viking tow them with a line affixed to their release hook on top rather than the designed towing connection points. Although there's some dispute among eyewitness testimony after the fact, investigations concluded that the high connection point of this tow line may have provided a significant enough tripping force when the capsule was hit with a particularly large wave to capsize it. Once inverted in the water, neither the Gulf Viking crew nor any of the passengers knew how to properly right or even exit the capsule. Upon further investigation, it was revealed that training in how to operate the capsules was minimal for the crew. The men who did survive did so out of their own resourcefulness or sheer luck. Ultimately, the Coast Guard deemed that their general lifeboat testing procedures, although helpful, did not sufficiently cover the nuances of individual vessels such as the Whitaker capsules. Going forward, in addition to more stringent requirements for crew emergency training, they plan to adopt vessel-specific testing criteria, including towing and righting in the event of capsizing. Lesson learned number 3, leadership matters. Perhaps the most surprising and foreboding factor that contributed to the loss of life on the Ocean Express were the multiple instances of leadership breakdown. For example, 2 separate phone calls were placed to the ODECO shore base on April 15th, one by the company man requesting helicopter evacuation and the other by the barge mover requesting advice. On his call, the barge mover was seemingly unaware of the company man's request, demonstrating how the other men on board did not trust his leadership and felt safer taking matters into their own hands. This distrust further boiled over when the barge mover got into a shouting match in the control room with the company man after trying to send the rescue helicopter away. The argument between the barge mover and tool pusher over whether it was safe to drop anchor without damaging the mat foundation is another example that not only demonstrates more questioning of the barge mover's authority, but also an overall lack of knowledge on the part of both men on how to properly respond to the situation. Finally, we have the life capsules. When drill pipe cargo broke loose on the back deck, the company man and tool pusher were convinced that all hope of saving the Express was lost. Against the wishes of the barge mover, they sounded the vessel general alarm and got the crew into the starboard life capsules. Up until the very moment of launch, they were trying to convince the barge mover to join them in the capsules to save his own life. Ironically, it would be the rescue helicopter that was ordered against his will that he tried to send away that would actually save the man's life. Once in the water, the 2 capsules had 2 very different outcomes, also due to leadership. The occupants of capsule number 1 were able to remain calm for the most part and cooperate with one another to safely transfer all 14 men over to the Nicole Martin. On the other hand, witnesses described the environment in capsule number 3 as chaotic. Starting from the point of launch, it was unclear who was in charge inside the boat, despite both the tool pusher and drilling superintendent being on board. When the capsule began slamming into the side of the Gulf Viking, there were further arguments and panic over whether to cut loose or remain attached. Finally, and most tragically, once the capsule inverted, survivors recounted several men refusing the pleas of their colleagues to attempt escape by swimming through the open hatch doors, insisting instead that they would wait for the capsule to be righted. Strokes of luck, like the heroic rescue of the barge mover by U.S. Coast Guard pilots, should not distract us from the clear leadership problems that are evident in this story. Although ODECO had a command structure on paper, they failed to account for the real-life, messy, human side of things that dictated that the barge mover was never truly in charge of the vessel. Even if he had enjoyed true authority, the evidence suggests that procedural and knowledge gaps still may not have saved the lives of the 13 dead crew members. Coming out of the incident, the Coast Guard and ODECO were forced to take a hard look at who should be in charge during which operations. There was disagreement over whether offshore drilling should be classified as a marine operation that features industrial activity or an industrial operation that occurs in a marine environment. Although several good suggestions, such as more extensive marine and stability training for tool pushers, came out of the discussions, there's no clear evidence that these rules were ultimately adopted by ODECO, or even that drilling personnel were encouraged to understand more about the marine side of the business. Unfortunately, this knowledge gap would rear its ugly head again just 6 years later on the subject of our next video, the Ocean Ranger. Thanks for watching, everyone. This one took a while to finish, but we wanted to keep the research thorough and the detail high. The inspiration for the topic, as we mentioned, came from a viewer who knew members of the crew who died in life capsule number 3. A lot of us out there work in the oil field every day, and many experience or otherwise get connected to serious incidents over the course of a career. That being said, most of these stories seem to quickly fade out of the news cycle after they happen without much follow-up. But we think the follow-up's important. We want to understand what actually happened, learn how to prevent similar mistakes in the future, and maybe even get a little closure after a loss. All that to say, if you've got suggestions for future topics that have affected your life or the lives of others you know, we're all ears. Research for the second video in this 2-part series on the Ocean Ranger is well underway. In addition to the standard in-depth recap of the events of the disaster, we'll also dive into the similarities between her and the Ocean Express. We'll have it out to y'all soon, hopefully, depending on work schedules as we close the year out. But until then, take care.